fix that. All right. Okay, so you heard the introduction, but I'll skip the part about studying anonymous and occupied. But a lot about what is online activism is kind of thrown out there, and I want to kind of point out that we're in an era where we're not even sure about those two words. So what's online and what's activism? Can it be as simple as clicking a like on Facebook and as crazy as self-immolation, as was the case at the beginning of the Arab Spring? And figuring out even what just counts as online is really, really difficult. It used to be really distinct. You dialed up to America Online and you knew you were online. Now, are you online or offline right now? Well, so you have cell phones. Some of you may be tweeting this. This video, it's a very decent chance a video posted means the majority of people who will hear these words in the world are doing them online in the future. It's also in all sorts of ways that aren't on the consumer end. Right now, our supply chains have transitioned to being completely online. You know, the drink that you're drinking and the supplies that got them here are predicated on shipping containers that are all managed through online networks and satellite systems. Like, there isn't really a tight distinction between online and offline. And we mostly don't think about that. We think about our time being online as like when we're logged in Facebook, and our time being offline when we're at the store buying things. When buying things is actually incredibly online now, as far as getting those supplies to your supermarket, in many, many cases. In contemporary activism, we think a lot about tents and protests, or at least I do. And in the course of covering these things, I have been to a lot of protests, and I have slept in a number of tents. I have very funny stories about that if you want to hear them later. And actually, there's a lot of disconnect, right? Like, there's a lot of traditional, I was working for Condé Nast, which is a very traditional media organization, and they had to figure out how to work with me when I was living in parks for them, which, again, came up with some really, really hilarious stories. The activist and prank collective Anonymous, particularly in the era of 2011, 2012, was a really powerful political player in both positive and negative ways. And it's still there, it still exists, it still crops up. Groups like Anonymous and other smaller collectives like Telecomics and all that have also done, to this day, tech support, essentially, for other protests. Even the umbrella protest in Hong Kong was assisted by Anons who were trying to get the word out and do information translation via different groups. But back in that time frame of 2011, 2012, it really did feel like anything was possible. 2011 was a crazy year. The Tunisians threw out Ben Ali, the Arab Spring began, and it really felt like these leaderless collectives that when they came together, that there was just like no limit to what they could accomplish. The Indignados took to the street in Spain, but the world started pushing back on this abusive system that's developed, this abusive banking system, and this governance system that has pushed people in society and even our planet to the brink in a lot of ways. One of the things that was consistent about these structures is that there weren't distinct boundaries and there weren't really leaders. And they were better, as we found out as 2012 progressed, at saying no to things. They were much better at saying no to things than doing anything else. And then it all started going wrong. And this is Syria. What happened in Syria after their Arab Revolution and a terrible and destabilizing drought, it was a refugee crisis. And that kind of gets us to where we are now. There's currently 60 million refugees worldwide, more than we even saw in World War II. Part of that, though, is increased mobility in the modern age and increased information. I suspect there were a lot of people in World War II that would have ran if they'd had Twitter. So we're really, in a way, the comparisons aren't super valid, because a lot of the people who sat through disasters or upheavals in the past didn't have access to the information we do now. now. And we forget that. We forget that you could live in a village and it would take you a month to find out what had happened across the country. Because it takes moments now. It's just part, it's not even part of learning something formally, it's just part of our collective consciousness now. Even if you're somebody who doesn't use social media is part of your collective consciousness because everyone around you is talking about it. Right now, if you live in an earthquake zone, which I often do, you will find out about earthquakes on Twitter before the S waves reach your house a lot of the time. That first happened in New York, it's happened in California a few times since then. But the planet is like, the planet and our systems are pushing back on this new way of being as well, and it's creating a lot of tension in the way we do our social organizing. When I was in Tunisia, one of the activists that was involved in the revolution, both in kind of a bit of wonder and a bit of fear, said that we're living in a post-punk era. There's no gods, no masters, no leaders like we used to have. And this was a real problem in Tunisia in particular that they've been wrestling with because they threw out Ben Ali. They didn't have anyone kind of coming in doing the abusive things that the Egyptian army did. But what they had was this gap. They had very old people who weren't compromised by the dictators, and they had very young people who had been involved in the revolution. But they had no one that could run for office. And they really, really have been struggling ever since. They've elected governments which have fallen for various reasons. And they've just been struggling to find anyone who knows how to run a country. And who knows how to run a country and that everyone can kind of get behind. And that's perhaps the more difficult problem. It seems to be the thing of the century that there aren't any great leaders. There's no ordained kings. There's no blessed caliphs. There isn't even a sense of great men in this century. The structures and parts of society that used to rely on those great men, on those great leaders, are suffering terribly, as is just the very idea of hierarchy. The very idea of father knows best is failing us. And what's problematic about that is that we don't know who knows best after that. Then we put it to a committee vote, and we all know how committees work on that sort of thing. Part of this is that I think, this is my theory, part of this is that we just know a little too much about people. It's hard to believe that somebody else is that much better than you, now that media is following around all the time and you can see that they're just as much of a jerk as you are. I mean, think about this in your media-saturated environment. In living memory, we had a president who was disabled and confined to a wheelchair, and no one knew it. Can you imagine trying to hide something like that today? This is a piece of graffiti from Egypt. If you can't see in the back, it's a field of pawns and a knocked-over king on the other side. And this is the image of what they thought was going to be the Great Revolution in Egypt. Is everyone coming together, the secularists, the Muslim Brotherhood, so on and so forth, and knocking over the corrupt leader. And the collective said no. And it said no very effectively. But there was no one person that could come in after that and say, okay, now let's say yes. Now let's build something. And no one leader could either unite the secularists and the Muslim Brotherhood or get past their own gaps. This is just from the other day. I don't know how many of you may or may not have seen this. This is actually the elected leader of the United Kingdom mouth breathing at the political opposition, saying the Labour Party is now a threat to our national security, our economic security, our family security. And that was technically stupid. Actually, I think Ice Cube here kind of speaks for all of us at that moment. And not only was that stupid, it's preserved forever. The first thing I personally did when I saw it is took a screenshot. What if they tried to delete that and I couldn't continue to do this? Honestly, many, many days, this is kind of my whole reaction to the internet. So so how are people responding to this, besides this way? Well, we're responding by trying to kind of build things from the bottom up, doing things ourselves that we once counted on hierarchies to sort out. And there's always been a bit of this, but not massively networked. If you wanted to build a playground here, you wouldn't suddenly turn to people in Turkey and France to help you fund it. That's pretty new. And in fact, like, I know a journalist in Asheville, and he started, which is in one of the Carolinas, and if I say it, I will always get it wrong. But he started a local online, he's very committed to local journalism, and I love his commitment to local journalism. So despite the fact that I have never been to that state, I actually, on Patreon, support the Asheville Blade. I have no reason to ever read it. Which is their local online news source. And that's kind of the weirdness of what we're living through. I'm not the only person who's doing that. There's a lot of us that now are going, that thing that you're doing over there, I like it in principle, I will support it. And that also means that people's investment in local infrastructure is changing. And what local means is changing. My interest in supporting something like the Asheville Blade or Playground isn't in supporting local in a geographical sense. It's about supporting local in a demographic and social sense. I am supporting people who share my values, wherever in the world they may be. And that is a really different conception of local. We spent a long time, especially in this country, trying to get people who are in one location to share enough values that they could work together. Now we're transferring into a system where the people in one location can get support from people who share their values anywhere in the world, which has the upside of meaning that if you want to build a playground, you have a much larger group of people to draw from. And the downside of meaning that if your local misogynist wants to jump on someone, they can get the help of thousands of horrible misogynists elsewhere in the world at the drop of a hat. Because one thing I have learned on the internet the last few years is misogynists have a lot more free time than I do. So we know that we can do these. We know that we can build playgrounds, fund local news, and attack women through lateral organization. But we don't know if we can build bridges. We don't know if this scales to actual infrastructure. And we don't know if it scales to infrastructure management. And I think it's fair to say that you cannot crowdfund trash collection. So this is a place where that thing that is pushing back and liquidating Syria and pushing and evicting these camps and all that is also the only thing that we know from above that can make sure the trash gets picked up. But we don't know actually if this is always true either. I don't know if any of you have been following events in Beirut, which has been really interesting for me. I've done some work in Beirut. But the government has been teetering on the edge of falling over the fact that no one was picking up the trash. They've been called the "You Stink" protests. So it turns out that hierarchy isn't necessarily the best for picking up the trash all the time anyway. And I think what we really don't know, that hierarchy and that leadership has failed to be what might be the biggest task of our century and our species, which is dealing with planetary level change and the consequences, social and physical consequences of that, like the drought that helped fuel the chaos in Syria. Is lateral organizing good for global problems? Is being able to aggregate that local interest in terms of values good enough to actually deal with some of these global issues? We don't know yet. Hierarchy is failing to do this, and we don't know if the other tools we have can do it, and we probably should find out pretty soon, because it's really not looking good on some of these measures. And if you want to scare yourself and not be able to sleep for a meeting, Google thermohaline cycle shutdown. And the good news is you'll be glad you live inland. So these structures, what are they good at? What are they good for? If they can't build bridges or effectively replace authoritarian dictators, what good are the Slactivists? Is it just that we want to take their clicks and convert them up the energy chain and get them into the streets? Or is online activism exclusively effective in the world? If we can use these structures to solve larger problems, how do we get to that point? Well, let's start by looking at the things that these structures have been good for in the past. And we do know for sure it builds really good encyclopedias, or a really good encyclopedia. I think it's not me, a family. Okay. And you know, Wikipedia is a pretty amazing tool. I use it on a daily basis. It's a great place to get scared by thermohaline cycle shutdown if you want to later. It's in a study, it was confirmed to be about as good or slightly better than Encyclopedia Britannica, in that the error rate was similar because of of how quickly errors get fixed and vandalism gets fixed. Now the difference in a similar error rate between Encyclopedia Britannica and Wikipedia is that Encyclopedia Britannica is about that big. And this is actually Wikipedia from a while ago, so it's bigger. Now, our traditional institutions are not adapting to this sort of change. My daughter was doing a report on Turkey not too long ago, and she starts texting me and asking me questions about Turkey. And being a loving and available mom, I replied, "Do I look like Wikipedia to you?" She says, "We're not allowed to do Wikipedia. We're not allowed to use Wikipedia at school." And my friends term this abstinence-only Wikipedia education. And she came home, and I was like, all right, let's look at citations, let's look at changes, and let's look at the talk page. And you're going to learn how to use Wikipedia, young lady, and then you're going to sneakily use it on your phone at school. Okay, go. That's one of the great rules in our household. Okay, go. But we know that the structure of Wikipedia, one of the things that makes it good is it's got those things. It's got a history, it's got talk pages, it's got these ways for people who are contributing somewhat at random to interface with each other, and it creates a structure of accountability built into it. So we know that's good. We know that we need a history, a place for debate, a place for a centralized product, being that final page that you look at and scare yourself with as you're going down your Wikipedia rabbit hole for the day. And that we can see what everyone's done, and that view makes things accountable. So there are technical structures that help with this. We know that it makes pretty good software. Lateral organizing and ad hoc software has gotten downright infrastructural. How many of you use Linux? How many of you realize that you use Linux on a daily basis anyway? A few more hands went up there. How many of you use Google? Congratulations, you use Linux. All your Google services, everything you're connecting to, are run largely on Linux server farms. So that is something you use daily. How many of you use cell phones? You're using flavors of Unix if you're using Mac-based things or Linux-based things. So if Android is Linux-based, and much of the Mac applications are ultimately, if you go back, based on BSD distributions. So these are what you don't know, beneath the pavers that you're walking on is this crazy open source software project. And that has good and bad qualities to it, right? It's great that these things are available. We've been able to build tons of products on top of these. People have been able to kind of bootstrap completely new ways of using information, between being able to Google something or look it up on Wikipedia, all based on this ad hoc free bits of infrastructure other people have built. It's got downsides as well. How many of you heard of Heartbleed? Heartbleed was a bug in a piece of free software which exposed a huge number of people's, potentially exposed, we don't know how widely any exposure was done, huge number of people's personal information, because essentially there was one guy in Europe who was doing this in his spare time, who didn't have any time, who was really tired, he wasn't very well paid, and he made a mistake, and billion-dollar corporations didn't want to spend any money to look at that code, said it was free, it was a real race to the bottom problem. Like, people were using all this and they didn't want to invest in anything to make it better. So this is where one structure is taking advantage of another structure and not reinforcing it. And then we get into things like the incredibly horrific state of computer security, which is a whole other lecture. If you want to be scared by that too, we can talk later. But this lateral organization also takes physical spaces. And one of the ones I like to talk about a lot is temporary autonomous zones. We've seen this rise of temporary autonomous zones in the last few decades especially. The most famous one that you hear about in the news that gets discussed a lot is, of course, Burning Man, where they go out and build a kind of a city of insanity for a week in the Black Rock Desert. And I think partly this gets a lot of play because who doesn't love putting pictures of dusty white girls in bikinis on the news? But it is an interesting one because it points, like the top page on Wikipedia, to some very important ideas about temporary autonomous zones, which is that you are the curator of your own experience of Burning Man. You don't get to blame anyone else for what you did or didn't see. You have to kind of take responsibility for yourself out on Burning Man in a way that you very rarely do in the rest of society. We live in what I like to think of as a safety rail society, and it's nice that we have safety rails and we have cars that don't turn into, crumpled paper as soon as we get hit in them. But there's a downside in that we kind of assume that if there's not a sign telling us something is dangerous, then it's safe. And we kind of assume that our experiences are curated all the time. We kind of assume that somebody is behind everything. And we aren't taking responsibility for our experiences when we're online. And the downside of that, I think going back to all the misogynists with free time, is that we aren't seeing ourselves necessarily as powerful actors in these temporary autonomous zones or on the internet. And that's, I think, one of the lessons that we have about organizing, is that from the moment you hit the ground, you don't have to wait to be blessed. You are full of agency and full of action. And nowhere gets to that point better than the hacker and maker movement, as it has gone along globally. This is from a hackerspace called Noisebridge, which I've been involved with for many, many years. And Noisebridge and other hackerspaces are like Anonymous, what Ryder Shirky called publish then select cultures. We're very used to select then publish, because literally a publisher will select something and then publish it. On the internet and in these lateral cultures, you put your work out there and then the crowd either selects it or it doesn't. So you do the work, and that's how you gain social capital. It's a real inversion on the rest of life. In the rest of life, you do the education, you get the qualification, you build a resume, and eventually somebody gives you responsibility for something. On the internet, you do a thing, and then if people like it, you've gained social capital. So the thing leads to the social capital instead of the social capital leading to the thing. Right now, like it would be kind of the equivalent of if you were a kid and you expressed a desire in a career in veterinary medicine. They said, well, here's a guinea pig and a cat. See how long you can keep them alive. The thing about the internet is there's endless cats. And guinea pigs. I just realized this is one of the only presentations I've done recently that doesn't have any cat pictures in it. I apologize. So another temporary autonomous zone, of course, was the camps. This was Occupy Boston, where, like in a lot of the camps, they use these little kind of crates disassembled crates to build. They built paths through the different areas, and this was Main Street, they called it, I believe. It was a while ago. Now, there's two real aspects of Occupy Wall Street, and one of them got a lot of media attention, which is the political aspect. We are the 99%, what do we want? Better society, so on and so forth. But once I was in the camps, I feel like the more interesting and much less talked about aspect of the Occupy camps was that they were systems of mutual care. They were places where people could kind of step out of normal society and take care of each other. And this was incredibly important for people. People who nobody trusted with any responsibility could come up, could show up and do the dishes. They could show up in the medical tent and volunteer for a while. People who were the discards of society, the homeless and the drug addicts, could come in and do valuable things for each other. And they could get care and they could give care. And it was a powerfully healing thing. And when it was ripped out, the results were devastating. There were a rash of suicides after every major eviction, people who fell off the wagon. I saw this over and over again. I get to go to therapy now too. But it was a devastating loss for people who didn't have any responsibility or agency in society normally. But these systems of mutual care are really, really interesting and important. Because mutual care is very different from care from the state or care from large organizations. It's different from vetted care. In some ways it's better, and in some ways it's worse. It's that amateur care that sometimes goes too far, but sometimes is the only thing we can save other people. And giving care is incredibly powerful. It makes you feel powerful in a way. It makes you feel part of the world in a way that just consuming things doesn't. The other thing I realized about mutual care systems in those camps, and have seen since, is that it's an indictment of the state as we know it. People who came to the camp came to get food and medical care and companionship after the cities that they lived in had discarded them. And that was as much threatening as anything else. Every mayor in America was terrified of camera crews going down and watching homeless people feed each other. Because it was, and I realized this when I was there, it was a way of saying, the state as we know it, government as we know it, have failed us, so we're just going to take it over. We're just going to take over those functions. And it is, I think at this point, still the most political act we can do in the contemporary world, is to say we're just going to take care of each other. And now we can do it at scale. And that gets interesting. This picture is from, of all things, a Skype ad, and it's about global remittance. I mean, I don't think they bill it that way when they put the ad on, but it's about somebody going to a first world country, getting a job, and supporting his family back home, and remaining connected to them through social media. This is an incredibly important trend, and let me just show it to you by the numbers. So this is not very readable on here. I apologize for that. The foreign aid is this developmental aid is this blue line here. As you see, from 1970 on to 2010, it remains relatively flat. A little uptick at the end. I think it's about 200 billion on there. Yeah, about 200 billion up to 2010. And that's paid from the wealthy world to the poor world for development purposes. That other line that goes up closer to 800 billion by the end, that's people traveling globally and remitting money back to the locations they're from. That jump that really happens close to the year 2000, that's cell phones. That's those cell phone minute shops that you walk by occasionally. That, give a list of countries you can call cheaply. And from there, it just goes up. Because it used to be when you moved to New York, start driving a cab and sending money back home, there was not a lot to keep you connected. People are staying connected and they're staying engaged over thousands of miles instantaneously. And one of the very first things you do when you move to New York and you get your cab job is send enough money back that they can buy the electronics they need to keep in touch with you. And many of these people will do this for a while, and then they'll go back and they'll have bought a house where they came from, that sort of thing. But this represents a huge transfer of wealth in the global world right now. And I just want to point out that this is trackable international remittance. This does not include domestic remittance figures. But to put that in perspective, If you've ever sent money back to your family or gotten money sent to you, you have participated in remittance. When your family sends you money so that you can do something while you're away, if your mom needs some help and you send some money back, you are participating in remittance. That figure is very low. It is much higher than that, especially when you start factoring in domestic remittance, which probably the majority of global remittances in general are domestic remittances, and there's really no way to count them. That's a lot of dry numbers on this, but what I want to say about remittance and this software is that this is love at a distance. This is how we express our desire to care at a distance. And there used to be a story, a very heartbreaking story, repeated many, many millions of times, of a parent who went away to the city, sent money back to the grandparent and their child, and they never saw them again, or they didn't see them for 20 years. And that was kind of the end of that. But the story's changed now. And in these connections, keeping people connected at distances, we don't know entirely what the consequences are of that. But I think when we look at this refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis, when we look at the immigration debates and all that, one of the things we're looking at is the fact that these borders don't make sense to humans anymore. At the era in which they are most harshly enforced, they make the least sense. Because local isn't about where you are in the same way it was. So what this is a principle from computer science, another thing, and other things that I know from computer science. A change in degree becomes a change in kind. Technically, your solar-powered $5, maybe $5 calculator, and this do the same thing. But when you can do it a lot faster, you can play World of Warcraft on one of them. And so you can say that a calculator and a contemporary computer are the same thing, but you're not really quite capturing the whole of the scene of that. This is why everything stays the same and everything is different. This is why we live that experience of feeling like everything's different and everything, but we're the same, but we're different. It's very, you kind of have to carry two conceptions of yourself and the world around now, because you've got this sense of change in your own lives and in your own communities, where some things just really feel the same, but a whole bunch of things are totally weird. And on a planet of 7.5 billion people, which is not a number we can hold in our heads, every minute I've been talking to you here, 13,260 years worth of human experience go by for 7.5 billion people. That's how much human experience passes. That's about how long we've had civilization. The entirety of what makes us human, what makes us contemporary humans, that level of time passing for humans passes every minute. It's kind of a weird time to be alive. This is my first Apple and my current Apple that you're watching this on. And this change, which is hilarious and extreme to me, has happened in this blink of an eye that we're starting to call the Anthropocene, this era where we are changing the world and we are remaking things. And the more we try to hold all of this in our heads at once, the more disjointed it gets. I spend a lot of time wondering if I'm the same person I was in the 80s. I think about that girl that I was in the 80s, and I think that if you put me now in the 80s and her now in my life, both of us would have nervous breakdowns. I would have a nervous breakdown in the 80s because I would have no access to information. And she would have one here because she would be totally overwhelmed by all the information. So who I am and how I memorize things and how I interact with people and how I interact with data has changed, but I still feel like me. And this is happening to all of society. We have all of these technologies now. We haven't learned how to live in them yet. I was saying at lunch with Jared and company, that I don't think we've quite learned how to use email yet. And that's pretty much the oldest one we have. So all bets to some degree are off. And yet, it's worthwhile to note that computers suck. That's my daughter. She was 11 in this picture. Computers are terrible. Security is worse. And we're kind of living through the great suck in a lot of ways. You know, where is your private information? Who knows? You know, I know my heart goes out to everyone registered at Ashley Madison. Many of whom probably didn't register themselves. God knows I still get a lot of replies from my email being used on websites I've never visited. And at the same time, like, you're constantly fed, you know, everyone you call after a data breach says your security is important to us. It's like your time being important to them when you're on hold. That's how your security is important. And then when we're in communication with so many people, we see so many ideas out there, it just gets really weird, and we get weird. We are definitely getting weirder. And partly, and sometimes we get cruel and inappropriate, and many of us have done this. But this is from a site called this is from a portion of a site called 4chan. This is the P board. If you have never been to 4chan, do not go. I do not want to be responsible. 4chan is a site literally based on seeing things that you cannot unsee. And I do not want to be responsible for your PTSD. But I did have to go for my work, like anonymous forums. The only people who are paid to go there, as near as I can tell, are me and feds. So derive what you want from that. But yes, being able to kind of delve into these other conceptions of local, not having to align yourself at all with your neighbors, makes us really weird. This is still my favorite quote about the internet. And this is from the 90s. We don't know how to live next to people on the network, and because of the network, we don't know how to live next to people in real life. So there's a lot of learning we have to do in the 21st century, because it's making us pretty crazy as a society. And we laterally organize, and we don't have a lot of feedback mechanisms to tell us if the thing we're laterally organizing is a good thing or a bad thing. It turns out no matter what you are doing next, there is somebody on social media that will tell you that it's the best thing, and someone else that will tell you that you're Satan. I promise. Which means that social input from our peers isn't really helping the way that it once did. And it makes for a lot of drama. It's amazing for making drama. And I mean, really, this is kind of how I watch the news these days, too. Like, is this not how we watch Donald Trump? I mean, even if you like him. So we're changing who we are, and as a consequence, we're changing what society is. And we're all spectators. But as they say in Burning Man, there's no spectators, there's only participants. We're all participants. Like, even if you're trying to be a spectator, you're still a participant. As soon as you pick up your phone or go to the grocery store, you're participating in the global chain, the global set of events that's happening right now. I call this the invisible city. It's a beautiful place, but none of us know how to cross the streets yet, because it's invisible. And it's a place of context collapse. And context collapse is a concept from sociology, 20th century sociology. It was about media making it so that the face that you presented to one community could now be seen where you didn't want it to be seen. And the classic example given was Stokey Carmichael in the civil rights era, who would speak with one accent to a white audience and another accent and set of vocabulary to a black audience. And then somebody said, "Would you come be on TV?" And he had to choose. And he chose to address his black audience. And Thousands and thousands of white people said, but I thought he was a good boy. Because they were seeing a culture that they didn't have a context for. And suddenly he became, to a lot of people, more radical, even though his message had never really changed. And we live in a lot of this now. This is why politicians do things like dog whistle, where they speak in coded language that can be interpreted by people who don't know, paraphrasing Bible quotes was one of the examples given during the Bush campaign. You paraphrase that, people who don't know their Bible don't catch it, people who do think, oh, he's our guy. But it's also this, this continual collapse that we're all living through, where you say one thing to a friend on Facebook and your mother's like, what? And people talk a lot about the loss of body language online, the loss of the expression. I don't actually think that's that bad. For one thing, we've replaced it with reaction gifs. What I think is maybe even more bad is the loss of architecture. You don't know when you log on whether you're logging on to a dive bar or a cocktail party. And when one person's at a dive bar down by the docks, and another person thinks that they're at a high-class cocktail party, hilarity ensues. And we are living through, I think, the great context collapse now. We're all taken out of context all the time. And this is the thing that trolls both suffer and profit from. But what to do about the context collapse? Because I don't think we get to go back to being really discreet. We all have windows into each other's lives that we didn't have before. I think the context collapse calls for a little bit more kindness than the network is currently exhibiting. That kind of live and let live, that's become more important now that we can see how other people are living. I'm arguing increasingly for us learning to be gentle. Because the one thing you can't see when you're online and accusing somebody of talking like a 13-year-old boy is whether they're a 13-year-old boy. One thing you can't see there is whether they're suicidally depressed. You can't see if they're a sociopath. You can't see if they're struggling with mental illness, if they're struggling with an abusive family, if they're just really young, if this was their first week on the internet. And we treat everyone on the internet like they're us. Like they've had exactly the same online experience we've had. And that's the context collapse. We just think everyone is us, and why would we be acting that way? So, Doug Saunders is an author, wrote a book called Rival Cities, very, very interesting. And he talks about the last great migration being the migration from the country to the city. But I actually think we're jumping right from that migration, which was through the middle of the 19th century up through the 20th century, where we went from 80% of people in the rural world to 80% of people in the cosmopolitan world, to this mass migration to the invisible city. When we moved to the city, we had to invent new social norms. We had to do what Irving Goffman called civil inattention, which is we had to pretend that we couldn't hear each other. You can't live next to 1 million people and act like you do if you live in a small town. You can't go to a cafe and listen to everyone else's conversations without being an asshole. You have to respect this invisible boundary that we decided to have between each other in order to be able to live in this kind of density. You had to respect that other people were going to have affairs and deal with their children in certain ways and do drugs and drink, and that it was none of your business. You had to stop looking through people's windows. We developed that norm, and then, because we're humans, we moved into that norm and assumed that we'd always been that way. That's kind of our trick, like assuming we've never changed, well, we change radically. And we did that with cities, and now we're all quite used to that. And we haven't done that yet for the internet. We haven't figured out how to use this technology, and we haven't figured out how to be in society with each other while using this technology. And I think that's one of the jobs of the 21st century, and one of the jobs of that activism, is to figure out how we organize in a way where we respect each other's boundaries when we can't see them. And I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope that we'll learn to be kinder to each other, and that we'll be able to organize better, and that eventually there will be a method of communication between traditional hierarchy and lateral organization. I don't think either one of us is going away anytime soon. You know, there was a whole era after the French Revolution where aristocrats and democracies had to figure out how to play nice with each other. And that time ended with World War I. And I would like it if we didn't do that again. Just want to go on record there. That figuring out how to communicate between democracy, which was the equivalent of like crazy anarchy if you were a 17th century noble, right? Like that was some crazy stuff that the kids were coming up with that would never work. Remember, if you read Democracy in America, Tocqueville's amazing, which I recommend, although it takes a while and is written very thickly. You know, he spends a lot of time going, I know that we can't have like good science and arts in a democracy, but it's worth it anyway. Like, there's that assumption built in that if you share power amongst a bunch of people, you can't develop all these things that they were able to develop by having a loose aristocracy doing things like building the Royal Society of London. We found out that you could, and then we built this. This was amazing. It's got its downsides, since we're trying to keep the planet alive now. But we kind of went so far in our organizations and our technology that I like to say we live on cyborg Earth now. Nature as we knew it is over. It's not to say all natural things are over, but nature as a pristine, self-regulating system is kind of done. It's not going to be self-regulating anymore because we've already put so much nitrogen in the ocean and we have to step in and manage things. Like that's over. We don't even have to have that fight. And instead we are beginning to understand increasingly that we are the stewards of the planet and not the subjects of it. We don't worry about apex predators eating us anymore. It's been a while. Now we need to worry about taking care of something that we've modified to the point where it needs our care to continue on sustaining us. And again, this is what I wonder. Can that activism and can that organization rise to this challenge? And can it communicate with traditional institutions and create a good, better, sustainable world? This is an amazing time to be alive and also a scary time. But wow, I don't know I'd pick any other. It's like now we get to find out whether or not we're going to make it. And I think about like the metaphors that we use to describe ourselves. We like to talk about ourselves as Victoria, she, or something like that. You see this, I think we look a lot more like slime molds. We are lots of little things, slime molds and anthills. We are an organism of society. We are already laterally organizing ourselves all the time. And now we're doing it in a hyper network. So more than anything, I think we just need to keep building the tools to do that. I'm very optimistic, but I know it's going to be a long road to get there. And we need to be kinder to each other as we're doing it. So I guess what I think will make lateral organizing work, plug in well to the world and help us, is taking care of each other, those systems of mutual care. And to start from that place, to start with taking care of each other and doing it on the network. Document it. Put it in Wikipedia. Let other people correct it. And just giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Not necessarily always looking into the window. Not Googling someone before you go on a date with them. Unless you don't mind if you see anything. That's my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions or open up for discussion, and thank you very much for having me.